You've probably heard the story of the Stanford prison experiment, right? It's that chilling tale they teach in basically every intro to psychology class. But what if that whole story, the one that's been shaping how we see human nature for like 50 years, what if it's all built on a lie? So picture this. It's 1971. We're in a basement at Stanford University that's been turned into a makeshift prison. You've got a bunch of perfectly normal college students, and they get randomly split into two groups: guards and prisoners. The story we all know says that things just went off the rails, a terrifying deep dive into human cruelty that's been used for decades as proof of the darkness inside all of us. And the man behind it all, the psychologist Philip Zimbardo, he kind of boiled it all down to this one powerful idea. He said, you start off as an actor playing a role, and after a while, you become the role. It's a scary thought, isn't it? That just putting on a uniform can completely change who you are.
Okay, so before we start poking holes in this thing, let's just quickly run through the official version, the one that ended up in all the textbooks. Let's call it A Prison in a Basement.
And the story we're told is pretty straightforward. You get random assignments. The guards, almost overnight, become these cruel, sadistic figures. The prisoners, they start having actual breakdowns. It gets so bad so fast that what was supposed to be a 2-week study gets shut down in just 6 days. The big takeaway was a game changer. It's not about a few bad apples. It's the bad barrel that turns people evil. I mean, it's a really terrifying story, but it also makes you stop and think, wait a minute, how on earth was a study that put people through this kind of psychological ringer even allowed to happen in the first place? To answer that, we actually have to take a step back from Stanford. We need to look at the really dark history that pretty much forced the scientific community to grow a conscience. This is the story of why we even have ethical rules for research. You know, these rules, they weren't just dreamed up in some academic conference. They were forged in absolute tragedy. It really starts after World War II, when the world found out about the horrific experiments the Nazis conducted. That led to something called the Nuremberg Code in 1947. But the lessons didn't stick. For 40 years, right here in the United States, the Tuskegee study knowingly withheld treatment from hundreds of African-American men with syphilis just to see what would happen. It was the public outcry over that study that finally gave us the Belmont Report in 1979, which is the bedrock of all ethical research today. And this isn't some abstract, theoretical debate. These rules were written in direct response to the suffering that happened in places like Auschwitz. It's a very real reminder of what can happen when the search for knowledge completely loses its humanity. So, out of that terrible history came one absolutely fundamental, non-negotiable rule: informed consent. It's actually a pretty simple idea. It just means you have the right to know exactly what you're signing up for, what the study's about, what they're going to do, and most importantly, what the risks are. And you always have the right to say, you know what, I'm out, and walk away, no penalty. Okay, so keeping all of that ethical background in mind, let's head back to that Stanford basement. Because in recent years, thanks to some really determined journalists and researchers who dug into Zimbardo's own archives, huge cracks have started to show in that classic story. We're about to see the lifespan of a lie. And this is where the whole thing just comes crashing down. So the story says the guards just naturally became cruel. The reality, which we now have on tape, they were specifically told by a warden to be tough. The story says a prisoner had a serious mental breakdown. The reality? Years later, the guy admitted he was faking it so he could get out of the study and go study for his grad school exams. So that whole grand theory about the situation creating evil, it starts to look a lot more like the participants were just doing what they were told. And you don't have to take my word for it. Listen to this. This is a direct quote from a recently unearthed recording of the experiment's warden, who was actually one of Zimbardo's students, briefing one of the guards. He says, every guard is going to be what we call a tough guard. You have to kind of try and get it in you. I mean, that is not a spontaneous transformation. That's a direct order. So this new evidence, it doesn't just change the narrative. It makes you ask an even bigger question about the whole thing's scientific value. Was this really an experiment, or was it just a piece of theater? Yeah, scientifically speaking, this thing is a house of cards. First off, Zimbardo wasn't some neutral scientist watching from afar. He was an active participant. He was playing the role of the prison superintendent. That's a massive scientific no-no. There was no control group, which is like Experiment 101. You need something to compare your results to. And maybe the biggest nail in the coffin: nobody's ever been able to replicate it.
The BBC tried to do a version of it back in 2002, and they got completely different results.
So if it wasn't the evil situation taking over, what was going on? Well, the most likely explanation is a psychological concept called demand characteristics. It's a bit of a fancy term, but the idea is simple. It's when people in an experiment try to be good subjects. They pick up on clues, figure out what the researchers are hoping to find, and then they give it to them. The guards weren't becoming evil. They were just playing the role they thought Zimbardo wanted to see. You know, even Zimbardo himself has kind of walked back his own language over the years. When all these criticisms started coming out, he actually suggested it shouldn't have been called the Stanford Prison Experiment. It should have been called the Stanford Prison Experience. And that is a huge shift. An experience is a story. An experiment is supposed to be science. So if it wasn't a real experiment, then what do we do with it? What is its legacy today? We really need to look at how we learn from these kinds of flawed studies to make sure nothing like them ever happens again.
That Belmont report we talked about earlier, it's the perfect tool for seeing exactly where Zimbardo's study went so wrong. It's all based on three main ideas. First, respect for persons, that's your informed consent. Second, beneficence, which basically means do no harm. And third, justice, making sure you're fair in who you select for your study. And on every single one of those principles, the Stanford Prison Study was a total failure.
And to make sure those principles are actually enforced, we now have a system of gatekeepers. It's called an Institutional Review Board, or IRB for short. Just think of it as an ethics committee. Every single research study has to get approved by an IRB before a single participant is recruited. And let's be crystal clear, a study like the Stanford Prison Experiment would never, ever get approved today. It would be dead on arrival.
So all of this leaves us with a really tricky question. The story of the Stanford Prison Experiment has had a huge real-world influence, showing up everywhere from textbooks to actual legal defenses. But we now know the story is a lie. The science is shot full of holes and the ethics are a disaster. So what do we do with a classic study that's both incredibly famous and fundamentally fake? How long is the lifespan of a lie?